Hi there, I'm back for the second half of the prologue, A Birthday Celebration. Where we left off, Mr. Bailey, the author, is being interviewed by Mr. Quinn about his child books that he's written. What would your advice be for aspiring authors? Mr. Quinn asked. It was a very important question to the author, and he went silent for a moment while he thought of a worthy answer. Always let the world inspire and influence you, but never let it discourage you. In fact, the more the world discourages you, the more it needs you. As writers, we have the profound privilege and responsibility to create a new world when the current one takes a turn for the worst. Storytellers are more than just entertainers. We're the shepherds of ideology, the street pavers of progress, and the scientists of the soul. If it weren't for people like us who imagine a better world and are brave enough to question and stand up to the authorities that suppress them, well, we'd still be living in the dark ages I was born into. It became so quiet the crowd could hear the ticking of a clock. At first, the author was afraid he had said something to upset the audience, but once they'd had a few seconds to process his words, the event space erupted with another thunderous round of applause. I'm afraid to follow that answer with another question, so why don't we open the questions to our audience members, Mr. Quinn proposed. Nearly all the hands in the room shot up at once. Mr. Bailey chuckled at the sight, tickled by how many people wanted to ask a question of an old geezer like him. Let's start with the woman in the brown shirt, Mr. Quinn said. The Starboardia series is much darker than most of your work, especially the history about American slavery. Were you worried that might be too much for your younger audience? Not once, Mr. Bailey said. I will never sugarcoat history so that certain people sleep better at night. The more we shed light on the problems of the world, past and present, the easier it will be to fix them. Now let's go to the boy in the front, Mr. Quinn said. How many of your characters are based on yourself? All of them, especially the villains, Mr. Bailey said with a wink. Now we'll go to the young man in the middle, Mr. Quinn said. What inspired you to write the Fairy Tale Topia series? The mischievous twinkle in the author's eyes grew so bright it practically shined like a searchlight. Would you believe me if I told you it was autobiographical? He said. The crowd giggled and Mr. Bailey's children collectively sighed at their father's remark. Not this again. However, Mr. Bailey's twinkle never faded. He looked around the room as if he was disappointed the audience wasn't taking the answer as seriously as the others. It's true, he said with conviction. This world was full of magic if you choose to see it. But it's a choice I can't make for you. The comment inspired a little girl in the third row to stand on her seat and wave her hand energetically in the air. Whatever her question was, she was more desperate to ask it than anyone else in the room. Yes, the young lady wearing pigtails, Mr. Quinn said. Hello, Mr. Bailey, she said. My name is Annie, and I love your books. I've read all 6 Fairy Tale Topia books a dozen times each. I appreciate that more than words could describe, the author said. What's your question? Well, it has to do with what you just said about Fairy Tale Topia being true, she said. Everyone knows Fairy Tale Topia is about a pair of twins who travel into a fairy tale world, but I bet a lot of people don't know you're a twin yourself. I looked you up online and saw you have a sister named Alex. So I assume you based Alec and Connie Baxter from Fairy Tale Topia on you and your sister. The question took Mr. Bailey off guard. His readers were usually so invested in the worlds he wrote about that they rarely asked him questions about his personal life, especially ones about his family. That is both creepy and correct, Annie, Mr. Bailey said. I'd say you have what it takes to be a private investigator, That's not my question, the girl said. According to my research, Alex Bailey attended school in Willowcrest until the 7th grade, but then she vanishes from all public records. I've looked everywhere but can't find a single document about where she went or what became of her after that. So I guess my question is less about the books and more about your sister. Whatever happened to Alex? The world-renowned author went dead silent and the twinkle faded from his eye. He was shocked not because of the question but because he couldn't remember the answer. He searched every corner of his patchy memory but he couldn't recall where his sister was or the last time he had spoken to her. The only memories coming to mind were from when Alex was a teenager, but he refused to believe that was the last time he'd seen her. He was certain he'd had some communication with Alex since then. She couldn't have just disappeared as the girl in pigtails claimed. Or could she? Mr. Bailey mumbled as he tried to focus. It was obvious something was wrong and the crowd began to shift in their seats. When the author realized his audience was growing uncomfortable, he laughed at their reactions like he was only playing a joke on them. Well, it's a simple answer, he said. What happened to Connie at the end of Fairy Tale-topia? He phrased the question like he was playing a trivia game with the young girl, but secretly the author couldn't remember the conclusion of his beloved series either. Trying to recall the whereabouts of his sister made him realize how much information was missing from his memory. She and Alec both had a happily ever after, Annie said. Did they? The author asked. I mean, of course they did. Then that's your answer. But Mr. Bailey... Well, this has been a wonderful evening, but I have to cut it short, the author said. I would love to stay and answer all your questions, but my 4 hours of consciousness are almost up. The author yawned and stretched like he was tired, but it wasn't a convincing performance. In truth, the mental void had terrified him, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep his fear from surfacing. Mr. Bailey always made jokes about his fading memory, but it wasn't until tonight that he realized it wasn't a laughing matter. Later that evening, once his children had dropped him off at home and made sure he was settled, Mr. Bailey searched his house for any clues he could find leading to his sister's location, but he found nothing. Not even a photograph. His children already treated him like a toddler, so he was afraid to ask one of them what happened to her. For peace of mind, he had to find her on his own. The author could envision every detail of his sister's face. Her pale skin, her rosy cheeks, her pale blue eyes, the freckles on the bridge of her nose, and her long strawberry blonde hair were instantly accessible every time he closed his eyes and thought of her. However, this was how Alex had looked in her youth. She most certainly would have been an old woman by now, so why couldn't he picture it? Oh, Alex, where did you go? He said to himself. Mr. Bailey knew only one thing could jumpstart his memory. He locked himself in his study and searched his bookshelves until he found copies of the Fairy Tale-topia series. Just as he told the audience at the bookstore, all 6 books were based on true events he and his sister had experienced when they were much younger. If he couldn't recall the information on his own, perhaps one of his stories would trigger the memories for him. Mr. Bailey eagerly pulled the first Fairy Tale-topia book off the shelf, but remembering the events that transpired each book wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. Think, old man, think, he said. Fairy Tale-topia, the wishing charm, was about our first trip to the fairy tale world. We were collecting something. There were things we needed to get back home. Oh, I know, the wishing spell. Our dad's journal helped us navigate and find all the items. We were chased by the big bad wolf pack and barely survived our encounter with the evil queen. That's also the year we met Froggy, Red, Jack, and Goldilocks. The old man was so excited to retrieve these memories that he jumped in the air and his back cracked, reminding him he was too old to be doing such movements. He put the first book in his series aside and moved on to the sequel. Fairy Tale-topia 2, The Evil Fairy's Revenge, he said. What on earth was that about? Wait, that was the year the Enchantress returned. We flew all over the fairy tale world in a flying ship called the Granny. Alex defeated the Enchantress by taking away her pride. Boy, was she brilliant for doing that. That was the same year we met Mother Goose and Mom married Bob. The second remembrance gave him a boost of confidence, and he eagerly moved to the 3rd book of the series. Fairy Tale-topia 3, The Long Lost Army, he said. That must be based on the Grand Army that tried to conquer the fairy tale world. The soldiers were trapped in a portal for over 200 years thanks to Mother Goose and the Brothers Grimm. Our uncle joined them and found a dragon egg. He raised the beast and our grandmother slayed it right before she returned to magic. Wow, I can't believe our mother let us out of the house after that one. As he moved on to the 4th and 5th books, the memories began to flow so freely he had trouble keeping up with them. It was like a tropical rainstorm had formed in the middle of a terrible drought. Fairy Tale-topia 4, The Literary Journey. That was when Alex and I chased Uncle Lloyd through the world of classic literature. We would have stopped him sooner if he hadn't separated us into Camelot and Robin Hood. Fairy Tale-topia 5, The Storyteller's Quest, was when we traveled into my short stories. We accidentally went inside Bree's writing and our Uncle Lloyd was trapped in the cemetery of the undead. We rushed back to the hospital to tell Alex what happened, but when we arrived, she was gone. The author pulled the 6th and final book from his series off his shelf and stared down at the cover. Fairy Tale-topia 6, The Great New York Adventure, he read. Unfortunately, the title didn't trigger a memory like the rest of the books had. Mr. Bailey tried as hard as he could to remember what the book was about and the events that had inspired it, but he drew a blank at every turn. The answer might have escaped him completely, but he knew that the information he craved was somewhere inside the book. Even if he had misled his readers to a happy false ending, he was certain he could read between the lines and discover the truth. So the beloved children's book author took a deep breath, opened his own book to the very first page, and began reading, hoping with all his heart that the story would remind him where his sister had gone all those years ago. And that is the end of the chapter. Chapter 1 is called Distress Call from the Public Library. I'll see you guys then.